Hello, good day and welcome to this session on performance and non-performance of contract. By the end of this session, you should be able to state the various ways in which a contract may come to an end or be terminated, as well as state the difference between a condition precedent and a condition subsequent. So, for every commercial relationship, there has to be a written agreement between the parties which binds the interactions between the parties. So for the interaction between a buyer and a supplier, they have to be operating within the scope of a given contract, because commercial relationships are different from social relationships or social interactions. Therefore, to avoid conflict, it is key that such a stipulation or such a contract or such an agreement, explicitly or one way or the other, determines how the contract would come to an end. And this session describes some of the basic ways in which a contract might come to an end. One of them is performance. So contract comes to an end after both parties have discharged their side of the contract, or after both parties have executed their part of the contract. So in a typical buyer-supplier relationship, performance in the contract when suppliers deliver goods to the customers and then the customers pay for the goods. In this instance, performance has ended the contract, meaning there was an agreement that a supplier should supply goods at a given time and the buyer would pay an X amount to the supplier. When this activity is executed, it means that both parties have successfully discharged or executed the contract. Hence, their discharge of any future contractual liability that might arise as a result of that contract which existed between them. So performance refers to the exact and complete fulfillment of contract terms by contracting parties. It basically discharges parties from any future contractual liability, because in the end, the contract has come to an end after both parties undertook their ends of the bargain. Second means of ending or terminating a contract is by agreement, and this is where both parties come to the agreement that the obligations have or have not been fulfilled, and therefore they are accepting partial fulfillment or partial performance. So, for instance, when a supplier agrees to supply 30 boxes of an item to a buyer, but because of certain unforeseen circumstances, they have an agreement they are not able to produce that 40 boxes. Therefore, they come to terms with the buyer that this is what they have been able to produce this far. So they should maybe they've been able to produce 30 or 35 boxes. So they will agree with the buyer that they have been able to provide 35 boxes. Therefore, the buyer should pay for that 35 boxes, and then contract would come to an end. In this instance, if the buyer agrees to pay the amount for the 35 boxes, the buyer has accepted partial performance, because in the end, the contract was to supply or to provide 40 boxes, but the supplier was able to provide 35 boxes. So acceptance of this 35 boxes and payment of this 35 boxes is subject to agreement, and this discharges the contract by agreement or ends the contract by agreement. So in terms of agreement, we have condition precedent and condition subsequent. So a condition precedent is what usually occurs for the parties to say that the contract has come to an end, or something that needs to occur before an event can take place. So in a typical arrangement, if this event doesn't take place, it means that the parties cannot deem the contract as having been discharged, and hence cannot deem the contract as coming to an end. So maybe the supplier is saying that they will be able to deliver the 40 boxes if the buyer gives an initial deposit of maybe 50% payment, Until the 50% payment is done, the supplier is not willing or is not going to supply the 40 boxes to the buyer. So that is a typical condition precedent. And a condition subsequent is also a term which permits the discharge on the happening of a specific event. So they can decide that both parties can decide that the contract has been completely discharged after the supplier has delivered the product, and then the buyer has paid for the product and the supplier has arrived at the premises. So until the supplier arrives safely at their premises, the contract might not be discharged. And this is seen in international trade where Incoterms are used and certain terms bind the execution or delivery of a contract or the ending of a termination of a contract. So one other mean of ending or terminating a contract is by breach, where there is a failure without a legal excuse to perform any promise that forms part or all of the contract. Breach basically describes the violation of a contract or an agreement that occurs when one party fails to fulfill their promises according to the terms of the contract. So maybe the supplier has promised to deliver 40 boxes in 2 weeks' time, and it's 2 weeks and the supplier has failed to deliver the 40 boxes. In this instance, it is not a partial performance. The supplier has outrightly breached the contract, and the buyer, depending on the nature of the breach, can consider the contract as coming to an end. And in this instance, there was no delivery at all. So the buyer can consider the contract as having come to an end and possibly sue the supplier for damages for any unexpected circumstances or outcomes that they will realize from such a breach. Another means of ending a contract might be as a result of frustration, where without fault of any of the parties to the contract is rendered incapable of being performed. And this may be due to unforeseen events or circumstances. So maybe the supplier has decided or promised to deliver goods in 2 weeks' time, and the payment for the goods is only warranted after the goods have been delivered. But maybe on the day of the delivery there was an earthquake or there was a natural disaster like flood which incapacitated the supplier from delivering those products. In this instance, it is not the intention of the supplier which resulted in the inability to fulfill the contract, but it is as a result of an unexpected and uncontrollable circumstance which has led to the contract being terminated or being unable to be fulfilled. And this is what we term as frustration. So in this session, you have learned about the various ways in which a contract may come to an end or be terminated, and you have also learned about the difference between a condition precedent and a condition subsequent.